look, if no one ever plays my music again, I am still going to be at that piano because that's the way I want to spend my days. And so I feel like, and again, not true for everyone, but for me, I feel like if I were to have another thing that I had to dedicate as much kind of time and care, same thing with children, right? What are they into? Okay, now are they interested in figure skating? How can I make sure that I get them in the exact right path? I'm thinking about that for all of my music. How can it reach the right people? How can I be there and present for the people who are playing my music? And I love being that person. I just want to be that person full time.
I'm Keltie McGuire, and you're listening to the Kids Are Childfree podcast. Hello, and welcome to the Kids Are Childfree podcast. Today, we're talking to someone who, in my opinion, has one of the coolest professions, maybe because she's the only person I've ever met who does this and gets paid for it and has been very successful at it. What is she? She is a professional composer, a classical composer. She is also child-free by choice, and we're going to be talking all about a creative life, being child-free. We're going to talk about being an only child and how that sort of frames this decision. We're going to be delving into all kinds of good stuff. So buckle up and get ready to hear from today's guest because you are going to absolutely love her. Reena Esmail is a concert composer who writes new music for major orchestras and choirs all over the world. Her work bridges the worlds of Indian and Western classical music, bringing people from different cultures and backgrounds together through music. Reena was trained at Juilliard, Yale School of Music, and did a Fulbright in India. Reena loves working with young people everywhere she goes and is always looking for ways to cultivate their unique creative spirits. Reena, we're finally doing this. We're having this conversation. I think you and I have talked about this topic.
It is wonderful.
Quite a few times offline. And I finally had said to you a few months ago, let's do this in the form of a podcast episode that everyone else can listen to. So I'm super happy to have you here today. Can you just tell us a little bit about yourself, a few things that we need to know about who you are?
Yeah, so I'm based in Los Angeles. I'm a composer. I'm like a classical composer, which I realize is a kind of an odd thing. I write music for orchestras, choirs, basically classical instruments. And I also work with Indian classical instruments. So my world is kind of bridging these two Indian classical and Western classical traditions. And that's what I've been doing for basically most of my professional career.
It's definitely a different profession in the fact that, aside from you, I'm not sure I've ever met a professional composer before. Every time the two of us connect, I am just eager to learn more about your world because it's something so different from the space that I work in. And of course, your child-free experience is both influenced by this creative pursuit of yours. And I'm sure your creative life has been influenced by being child-free. So we're going to talk about all of that and more, including I understand you're an only child, which
I am an only child.
Yeah,
yes.
And you have an Indian background. Both your parents from India?
So actually, all four of my grandparents are from India,
Okay.
but my mom grew up in Kenya and my dad grew up in Pakistan, and then they met in Florida in the 70s. So I am like the American dream, I guess.
You're very much the American dream. And I'm sure all of those different cultures and experiences both certainly have shaped you and maybe also played a role in feelings around choosing the child-free path or what it's meant in a family context. So we're going to dive into all of that and more. But before we get into some of the nuances and specifics, I'm curious, are you somebody who always identified as child-free, or were you clear from the get-go that you didn't want kids, or what was that like for you?
Yeah, I think like many of your guests, when I was young, I didn't realize that you couldn't have kids or that was an option to not have kids. And I remember I was saying to my mom at one point, so my mom is Catholic and I grew up Catholic. And I remember saying to her, like, hey, what happens if I don't want to get married and have kids? And she, kind of joking, she was like, oh, well, then you have to become a nun. And I was like, okay, yeah, I'm fine with that. I'm fine with being a nun. And she was like, that's not what I was trying to kind of dissuade you. But what's interesting is when I realized that that was the other option, I thought, oh, okay. Here's a person who gets to kind of commune really deeply with some higher spiritual calling and gets to like dedicate her life to that. And I'm like, yeah, I'm in. And, as I've gotten older, I've definitely felt like a lot of my life is similar to that, where I do spend a lot of time kind of communing with higher spiritual worlds. But when I thought about, possibly having my own children, it's funny because if I were to really go back and analyze it, I was always thinking about, okay, what would I be like as a mom to a teenager? I never thought about having a baby. Like that was never in my world. And I was also one of those kids who, wasn't gravitating towards baby dolls, wasn't, wanting to hold babies. I was like, yeah, when I can have a conversation with someone, then I'm totally happy to do that. So, I never ruled it out, but I never knew it was an option to rule it out.
Yeah. It sounds like you were truly ambivalent or indifferent. Like there wasn't necessarily maybe there was some distaste in the fact that you had preferred or thought that going to the nunnery seemed like a better idea. No shade on nuns, of course.
Yeah, nuns are amazing. Yeah.
Calling, yes. But, that, again, like counter to your mom's intention to say, okay, well, if you don't have kids, you're going to have to be a nun. You were like, yeah, cool. That sounds like a more interesting or better path to take.
Well, the other thing I was going to say is that it's interesting because in my young life, when I look at people, you're a child and you're looking at people and there's some people you think, oh, I really want to be like that person. When I looked at those people, they were mostly women who didn't have children. And some of them were like, when I was young, when I was in my early 20s and teaching piano or something, some of my piano students who didn't have children and were really interesting people living in New York who had these full lives and were studying piano as an adult and were deeply questioning things. Or I think there were maybe 3 or 4 women I could point to who didn't have children who I was like, I want to grow up and be like them. And I didn't realize that they all had that in common at that point, but it's true.
Yeah, super interesting. And also cool to hear that you did have those role models and mentors, because I know for me, like I really didn't see any examples of women who had chosen not to have children, or even through circumstance. I mean, probably who struggled, but who ultimately through, whatever path, whether it was, I don't even know if IVF was quite a thing when I was growing up, but like were eventually able to become pregnant or to adopt or whatever that path looked like. And so for me, it was probably quite a bit later when I realized it would like, not just intellectually knew, but like I really saw it as a viable choice that I could forego having kids. And so for you, like when was that turning point of like, oh, I actually can legitimately not have children and that's what I choose? When was that decision point?
I think it was pretty late, and it happened in a very interesting way because, I was in a relationship from the time I was maybe in my early 20s, like 22 to about mid 30s. And I was with this person who is not the person I'm married to now, but we were kind of on again, off again for a long period of time. And we were actually set up by our families. So it was a thing where his grandfather and my grandfather went to the same mosque. I'll say my dad's side of the family is Muslim, so interesting family altogether. But it was that kind of thing. And, legitimately, we did have so much in common. But when we kind of split up, the fatal flaws were fatal, right? And when we split up, I think we both realized that neither of us had wanted that traditional Indian path of getting married and settling down and having children. Because even now, he's someone who's still, a friend of ours and is also just kind of doing these things that he chose not to have that regular life. And I also chose that. And so I think we were bound by the fact, and I realized we were bound by the fact that we both assumed that the other person wanted that path. And so then, when I finally met and got together with the person I'm married to now, there was this moment initially where we thought, oh my gosh, we love each other so much. It would be so great to bring a child into this world. But then when we really thought about it practically, we looked at, people around us who were kind of, musicians. And also, musicians, it's not like you have this steady job and you know exactly what's happening. I think we just thought like, maybe this is not the most practical thing to do. And I think it really came down to, when we were in the pandemic and we were seeing what parents were going through and what they were saddled with. And, there were some people who decided in the pandemic, oh, this is my chance to have a child. And then there were other people in the pandemic who thought, there's no way that we can do this. And I think we thought that. So, and again, it was kind of fine with both of us. But then there was this point where I was on the phone with my mother in the pandemic. And she said something about, oh, well, when you have kids, da, da, da. And I was like, well, we're certainly not going to have kids. And I could tell was like, oh, she was holding out for this thing. And I could just feel her heart just break in that moment. But I knew like, okay, I'm putting a stake in the ground now. And I think that was the moment. Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah. There was conviction there. Like certainly I know both firsthand as well as talking with so many women who are on the fence about this, that like when we state something to anyone really, like affirmatively, like, yes, I'm doing this, or no, I'm not. I feel like that does really crystallize and make it real for us. And that can be really a tough conversation, especially when it's choosing not to have kids where our own parent or parents are concerned. Yeah,
Exactly.
funny what you say about the pandemic, because I was in the same camp where I think at that point we'd already, that's interesting. I feel like we'd already decided at that point, I guess, not to have kids. And yet it was still because it was like around that time that we had been on the fence and I was really making this decision. I think it felt really present. And similarly, I was like, this is so crazy. All these people are having children. Like, why would you have kids right now? And like, and I mean, again, like not
No
to cast a
judgment.
negative.
Yeah,
Yeah, no,
totally.
like I see now why it made sense for people. But from my view, everything just spoke against that being like a good time, if you will. But
Right,
but
right.
you're right. Like it's, and this is something we talk about in the podcast, is how the very same experience both is experienced differently, and then what we take away from it is different. It's like we can look at two people who had a really difficult, let's say, upbringing or relationship with their own parents, one of whom is eager to, there's no true do-over, of course, for our own childhood, but like to have an experience and share something differently with our own kids and instill more like love and to sort of like heal those wounds. And then other people, that really puts them off the idea of being a parent. So I find it so interesting how all these different factors come together and can lead in some cases to, yes, let's have kids, and others, no.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, so I'm interested, like with you, and it sounds like you and your husband were both fairly, ambivalent or unsure. Should we do this? Should we not? Talking to other couples and women in particular, like they feel a lot of pressure to be the driver of that decision, probably for all, for the right and wrong reasons.
Right,
What
right.
was that
Totally.
dynamic like with your husband? Like, was he like, you decide, or do you feel like did you truly navigate every step of that together? Or how did you jointly make that decision?
Yeah, that's a good question because I think we just backed our way into it. And I think it's funny because we kind of backed our way into our entire relationship. We were
Mm,
colleagues, we worked together for years. And then at the time when we finally were both single, we thought
yeah.
like, oh, wait, we should have more than just a friendship. This sounds right. And so then when it came time to kind of think about these things, it was always situational where we'd look
Mm,
at this and be like, okay, well, if we had a child, would we be able to travel? Would we be able to do this thing? And we just realized because I think sometimes, as an artist, you're always kind of trying to tap into this energetic third rail and you're trying to kind of find what feels true. And I just felt that everything was leading me away from that path. And that if I
yeah.
really wanted to, I could really, rend it back into being. But just the
Yeah.
way that the flow of my life was naturally going, it felt like, okay,
Mm,
if I just follow the energy, it's leading me away from this. And VJ, my husband, too, was in a similar state because, unlike me, he was a person who grew up as a child prodigy, essentially. It's a kind of a weird thing to say, but he was one of those kids who was playing the violin on orchestras from the time he was 8 years old. And he basically he went to college at 13. Like he did not have a childhood. He was in a
wow.
major orchestral job from the time he was 19 years old. And so I kind of see he's gone through all these careers. He's so good at doing all these different things. And I realized okay, part of the safety of our relationship is that I can allow him this time and space to actually be a person and just explore the things he wants to explore and be creative in the way he wants to be creative and
Yeah.
not feel this pressure of having to support me or having to support another person or and so to me when I think about okay, what's the best gift we can give each other, it's the ability to support one another's creativity. And especially
Hmm.
the older we get, the more we're able to think more broadly because we're not just trying to get our first jobs or maintain something or whatever. We actually can do really deep thinking that we've always wanted to do creatively. And so when I saw that, I thought, this is the best thing that we can do for one another. And it has
Yeah.
been, because we're able to actually give one another that time and spend so much time with one another. So I mean, even to your point, it's not that we had to sit down and have a discussion about it because we are always talking to each other at all times about
Yeah.
all things. So these things just kind of happen. And there's never, I mean, there's sometimes times where we're traveling and we're in different time zones, because obviously we're both artists on the road, and we do spend a lot of time together when we're together, but then we'll be apart for a few weeks and stuff. And there are times where I don't talk to him for like 48 hours. And I feel like, wait, did this thing even happen if I haven't told him about it? It's like that level of the amount that we talk about things. So
yeah.
Yeah.
You shared so many things. I'm trying to capture them all. I mean, first of all, I like how you sort of parallel it or talk about like this, I don't want to say inner artist, you have an outer artist as well, but talking about this sort of energetic flow that you wanted to move into and with. And for myself as well, and I think, and this is probably true for a lot of people who are in the midst of the decision. A lot of the things that we talk about and share on here, I think these are often insights that we get after the fact in looking at how that process went. And so for me as well, and my mom actually pointed this out when she was on the podcast, she said, I saw the decisions that you were making in your life and like that was taking you in a certain direction. And so she said, for me, I wasn't surprised because it kind of made sense based on these different decisions you've made. And I don't think I was realizing that, but yeah, effectively I was constantly taking myself further from having children, which is not to say that the decisions I made were not compatible with having kids. Of course, people move to foreign countries and have kids. Of course, people choose business ownership and have kids, all these things. But I was very much always moving towards, true autonomy and independence and a kind of, I guess, freedom or sort of adventurous life that I, in my case, felt incompatible with having children. And again, it's only after the fact and you pointing it out that I'm like, oh, I love that feeling or thought of going with that energetic flow. And so I think that's a really beautiful offering for our listeners to think about what's the energetic flow of your life, if you will. And is that something that you can sort of tap into, not just from like an intellectual viewpoint of like, I see what's happening, but like a feeling sense. Do you have any suggestions on how somebody might do that?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that you say that because, another thing that came to mind in that vein is that, as someone who is like, I'm a smart person, but I'm also an educated person. And those two things are not always mutually compatible with one another. And I think sometimes when we know how to make points and, debate well and, quote studies and whatever, we can convince ourselves of anything. And one of the things that I've had to come to terms with as a person who has a doctoral degree is that I need to kind of sometimes get outside my own mind and figure out how to trust my intuition in places like this that are about a gut feeling. And so one thing that I realized, if I have to just break it down to, what are you thinking at the time and what does that feel like? Almost every decision in my life has this element to it of like, okay, if everyone is doing this one thing, I just want to do the other thing. And almost everything that I've done, because when I became a composer, there were not women in this field. It was just a bunch of guys and me. And I thought, oh, that sounds fun. I'm the only person who's doing this, who's a woman. That's really cool. When I decided to do stuff with Indian music, same thing. It was not a thing where people were trying to work between cultures. I just thought, everyone's over here doing this one thing. I want to do this crazy other thing. And so sometimes what I think, and when I really think about it, say I see someone doing something and they're doing it really well. Like say, I meet someone who's a mother and they're an excellent mother. And I know so many people, I'm just like, these children are going to like be our next leaders. They're so amazing. And I'm like, they've got this. They seem like they're raising these great kids. I don't also need to raise a great kid because this kid is going to be great. And so I feel like that about so many of my friends who are excellent mothers. And, the other thing to note is that just like this comment about, oh, well, you're so good at this, like you should be a mother, blah, 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 right? I've heard this in so many places, but I usually mostly hear essentially this idea of like, I want this thing, so you should want it too, from people who are more struggling with that thing than people who are really confident in that decision. Because there are many people also, again, I said, I have a doctorate. Technically, I could go get a teaching job at a university. The people who are the most trying to convince me that I should get a teaching job at a university are people who are insecure about that job.
Yeah.
And people who love doing that thing are like, hey, this is really tough. Like, there's a lot of tough elements. I would totally get why you don't want to be a teacher at a university right now. I totally get why great mothers are like, yeah, there's a lot that I have to do for this child. I totally get why you wouldn't want to do this. I am like, look, yeah, my life is really, there's very many tough things as a composer. I don't think this job is for everyone. Like, if you really want this, do it. But if you don't have to do it. And so I think like that's a thing that to kind of watch of like, are people kind of saying, I want this and therefore you want it? And where is that coming from? So I mean, all of these things are ways to get outside of our intellectual brain and just kind of start to trust our intuition about things.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great suggestion, and also a good way to take other people's opinions and comments less personally, to realize like this has everything to do about them. And it may mean that they might be dissatisfied with that path. They might not, but I think often we want to like justify our own choices. And therefore we feel like the more people we can get to our side, the more validation we're going to have and feel.
Exactly.
I also want to point out, I really like what you said about you and your husband, as far as like, it was an ongoing conversation because the two of you are constantly in communication with each other. And I will say, I think if there's a real difference of opinions amongst partners, it can be helpful to take some time to yourself to really align with what you want, because oftentimes we can be consciously or unconsciously swayed by what our partner wants. But it sounds like the two of you, although you had different experiences and upbringings, you both obviously lived this, very creative, artistic life, that you both felt very drawn to the aspects of that child-free path. And I want to remind people that it doesn't have to be like a single, and it shouldn't be like, okay, let's sit down tonight and talk about this. Of course, if you're having trouble doing that, it can be good to really have some dedicated time and space. But to really weave this topic into your everyday, I think is going to be one of the best ways to both help, I guess, solidify your own feelings, but it's also going to help you better understand what your partner's view is of this decision, because you might uncover through those ongoing conversations, oh, wow, we have really different perspectives on what it is to have a child or what it is to have a child-free life. And I think that's something we only can really tap into if it is part of an ongoing conversation, as opposed to like, let's talk this weekend and then like, that's it sort of thing.
Yeah. The other thing also just to note is that like my husband and I got together when I was in my mid 30s, right? So it's like I was already a much more developed person. I had been through a lot in my life. So had he. And so having these conversations as people who are a little bit older and have more of a sense of your own values, where you spend a lot of those years in your 20s apart from one another, actually, I think made it easier for us. I don't know that if we had gotten married in our 20s, we would have had as easy a time as we did. So that's true as well.
Yeah, you'd had a chance to like shape your own sort of personhood. And of course, you'd had this previous long relationship where you both had that assumption the other person wanted kids, and it turns out to have not been the case, which is interesting as well. I find that to hear that although the relationship didn't work, the two of you both have taken the path less well-traveled.
Exactly. And that we just weren't willing to admit it to one another.
Yeah.
And, we're too scared to be like, oh, I want, and I get it. I mean, so for women who are like, oh, I don't want to talk to my partner about this, I completely understand, because I was that person in my last relationship. Yeah.
Yeah. And that's such a good example of why you should, because I'm sure there's people listening who may be in a similar boat right now. And I've heard quite a few stories like that, specifically from women who end up choosing the child-free path, because of course we see kids as being the default, which, as Merle Bombarderi talks about in the Baby Decision book, like she really believes, and I love this perspective, especially since she's a mom, that the default should be not having kids. And then we're opting into having children as opposed to opting out of having kids.
Right.
I wanted to point out something else. I like what you said about your husband, as far as this idea of like him having had to effectively grow up so early, not having had a real childhood, and like the freedom and not just the freedom as far as how we normally think about being child-free, but how it's allowing him to have a different kind of autonomy that maybe he didn't have when he was young, to really maybe be playful and curious and do what he wants to do, as opposed to like this track that he was on. And I think it's interesting you mentioned that, because we often hear about people choosing to have kids because it allows them to, or maybe this isn't why they do it, but like a side benefit is it taps into their inner child and they can relive their childhood and they can see the world with curious eyes again. And I really appreciate you offering a different perspective, which is actually, in fact, staying child free. And I've actually heard older, like more child free elder women talk about there's a different kind of youthfulness often with women who've not had kids who are older in age than, let's say, their peers who did have kids.
Yeah.
So yeah, just an interesting perspective you shared there as far as actually maybe not having kids is what allows us to be childlike.
Exactly. And I think, again, it's just following that line of energy of what feels like where does it feel like your life is going? And do you want to fight it or not? And there are many times where I have fought it and there are many times where I haven't, but I think that should be a conscious decision.
Totally. Okay, so here's a question, because I often talk about that with my coaching clients. Like, what is the discernment like for you to know when is it something to fight or to overcome? And when is it something that you're like, nope, this is just, I'm not on the right path? What would you say?
I think, well, so for me, this happened in a different way where so basically after I had done my master's degree, I applied for two things. One was a Fulbright to go to India, and one was a doctorate degree to continue my studies. Mm-hmm. And I kind of applied for the Fulbright as a first choice and the doctorate as a backup plan. And so I got the Fulbright and the doctorate acceptance. I went to India. I had the time of my life. It was amazing. It shaped everything about me. I came back and I was a little bit scared, right? Because I'm back in this country, haven't been here for a year. And everyone was like, Reena, you'd be crazy not to just do this doctorate. You got this acceptance. Why wouldn't you do it? And so I did it kind of out of fear. And I felt in my body that I was reacting from a place of fear. And those 2 years, I mean, I felt terrible about myself. And this is the other problem, is that when you are able to do something, yes, technically I did get a doctorate. I did everything I was supposed to do, but at what cost? And the cost was then the strain on me physically, mentally, spiritually, was so much because I knew it was in conflict with what I wanted to do. I actually tried to drop out a number of times, and every time it kind of came down to this feeling of like, well, you're almost there. Why don't you just do it? Blah, blah, blah. And still to this day, I will tell you that my feeling towards it is a little bit of guilt, because that program is very difficult to get into. And I know that someone else could have used that place. And I took it when I didn't really want it. And so so whenever I now think of decisions in my life, I try to go back to that body feeling of like, what did it feel like to make that decision to do something that I knew I didn't really want to do? What did it feel like when I was actually doing it? I mean, I remember there was this point where I was standing in front of the admissions office just crying, and I couldn't get myself to walk in and quit. But I was just like, I am at my bottom here. And then, what's the feeling afterwards of having done something that I felt like wasn't the way I wanted to be in life, And again, no knock on this program, no knock on the teachers, whatever. It just, I knew it wasn't right for me. And so I feel like because I had that experience and because I kind of processed the emotions and the body feeling about it, I can access that at any time and know whether a decision feels like that or not.
Yeah. Okay, that is hands down one of the best stories that I've had told on this podcast. That is so good. That is such a great example of what it is to tap in and listen, or in this case, not to listen to this sense of this isn't the right thing for me. And like you say, I mean, all signs were pointing to yes, from an external's perspective, right? You got into this program. It was scary to go into that big, wide musical world. I'm sure there was, in some sense, a feeling of security of it's, and I'll offer a parallel with, I was going to say I'll offer a parallel with parenthood, but it depends on who you are, because for some people, there's more certainty and security in the child-free path because they're living it now. But in any case, and I know I don't need to spell out the analogy for everyone, but I just want to reiterate it because it's so good. People saying, hey, this makes sense, just do it. You have the capability, and you doing it, like it ate you up from inside. And the result was feeling this sort of guilt and regret and this like wanting to opt out, but feeling like I'm on track now. And of course, specifically with having kids, there's no real opting out.
Exactly.
Yeah, and I like that you can go back and access that. And so an invitation for people listening, like maybe it wasn't a doctorate, but maybe there was something else, whether it was school related, work related, relationship, where there were perhaps external pressures or any sort of, maybe there weren't external pressures, but paying attention to a decision that ultimately didn't end up right for you, despite the fact that it maybe made sense on paper. What was that discernment piece that you perhaps missed, and how can you tune into that next time with a decision
Yeah,
like
because
this?
exactly, because the opposite side of this is also true too. There have been many times where everything has been pointing towards like, Reena, this is not a great decision. Because I mean, imagine the decisions that I would have had to make to become a classical composer that works between Indian and Western classical music, right?
Yeah.
Now, because my career is going and everything, it seems like, oh, that was inevitable. Da, da, da. At that time, it was like ridiculous decisions that I had to make that would completely take me out of the running for normal opportunities that composers would have. And bear in mind that most people who go to school for composing do not become composers, professionally full-time composers. And so even the idea that I was going to do that with my life was insane. And yet the body feeling was like, I know I've got this. I know I can do this. I really feel like I can see the next level, and I am going to do this or die trying. And, regardless of whether you choose to listen to that or not, that feeling is also the equal and opposite feeling.
Yeah. Oh, and I was going to say, you may have died trying, but man, you are like the fact you followed that. Total sidebar, but sometimes we include things in show notes, and I'd love to include links to a couple of the pieces you've composed.
Yeah,
because
totally.
I mean, I'm getting goosebumps thinking about it. I'm not familiar with the world of classical music composition. I don't listen to a huge amount of classical music. Of course, this intersection that I know a lot of your music has with Indian music, Indian folk, is it, or Indian
classical?
Yeah, it's incredible. So I've now taken us off a little detour, but check the show notes and then reach out to Reena and tell her what an incredible talent she is. I mean, I'm sure you've heard a lot.
Thank you, Keltie.
Okay, so I know a lot of women who are on the fence question compatibility between their career and motherhood. And, of course, we hear, yeah, you can do it all and you can have it all. And there are incredible examples of women who are able to excel at both, whatever excelling at motherhood means. But I mean, they're able to competently, capably, in a good enough way, raise reasonably good humans. I mean, we'll say that's successful parenting, whatever that means. And they also have fruitful careers. They reach different milestones and goals. They become recognized in what they do, or they excel, they impact people, again, whatever that measure of success is. And I know, having talked with many moms, that from the outside, things can look pretty glossy and good, and they've struck a balance. But of course, behind the scenes, it can be a struggle, just like it is for all of us, right? Like even being a child-free person, you of course have struggles in your career and on your path. But I guess I want to hear, so first of all, for you, how much of a factor has your career and your creative pursuits, how much has being child-free and that decision played into that? I'm curious just to sort of hear about the intersection of the two. And then, do you think you would have had to make, I guess, concessions in your career if you would have had kids?
Yeah, I mean, it's such a hard thing to talk about without alienating mothers, because there are certainly a lot of mothers who are, doing it all and are wonderful composers. I think for me, one of the interesting revelations I had at a certain point is that I think I maybe have a similar way of thinking to a person who's a full-time mom, right? And I'm imagining what that person is like. Someone who is like, look, I've had these children. I absolutely love them. I want to be in the position to give them absolutely everything that I can. And so if I need to show up at their preschool and do a thing, I'm there. If I need to do something to make sure that they get into the right college, I'm there. And you think about the mindset and dedication of a full-time mom, I feel the same way just about my work and about my music. And bear in mind also that we talk about career, and I think there's kind of a difference between career and vocation, especially when you are in the arts, right? Because my career is oh, I need to answer emails. I need to set up travel. I need to do all that. That's my job. My vocation is that I'm sitting here at this piano for hours a day, just being like, okay, what is in the ether? And how can I make that ether into sound? And then how can I channel it through my body so that it becomes tangible enough to put on a page so that another person can make it feel like it's coming out of their body? Like that's what I do every day, right? And so
More
that's
than a career,
really,
for sure, more than a job.
exactly, right? So I think a lot of people will make this argument of like, oh, your career will come and go. I'm like, look, if no one ever plays my music again, I am still going to be at that piano because that's the way I want to spend my days. And so
Yeah.
I feel like for me, and again, not true for everyone, but for me, I feel like if I were to have another thing that I had to dedicate as much kind of time and care, same thing with children, right? What are they into? Okay, now are they interested in figure skating? How can I make sure that I get them in the exact right path? I'm thinking about that for all of my music. How can it reach the right people? How can I be there and present for the people who are playing my music? And I love being that person. And, I just want to be that person full time. And so, yeah, very much similar to someone who chooses to raise children full time, I think.
All right. So, a lot of my clients and followers know that I love outdoor adventures, especially going hiking in the Alps. But a lot of people don't know that I have quieter, more relaxing hobbies as well. And one of my favorite things to do with my time is to read. I love reading all kinds of different books. And my clients know that I usually have a book for virtually every single challenge they may be facing. That's why I've put together my free kids or child-free book guide that contains 22 and counting different book titles, all about how you can make this decision on whether or not you want to have kids or stay child-free. I've included books about the child-free choice. I've got books about motherhood. As mentioned, I've got books about how you can make this decision. I've got fiction books in this guide, nonfiction books. There is a lot to choose from. And for every book that I've mentioned in the guide, I've got a brief description so you can learn a little bit more about the book. And I've also linked to them on Amazon so you can go ahead and purchase them. Although, of course, I would highly suggest you purchasing from an independent bookstore if you can find the title there. Go ahead and download the guide if you're a reader like I am and you want some support making this decision. I know you're going to love the books that I've shared in there as much as all of the people who've already downloaded this guide. You can find it at kidsorchildfree.com under the free resources tab, and I'll also link it in the show notes. Yeah, and so for you, it sounds like it's not just a matter of like if you could have done it or like reached certain milestones, but it's the fact that you want to dedicate your full self. I mean, not every waking moment of your day, but it's like, right. I know so much of yourself goes into this work, and you have passions kind of like an overuse word, right? But it's like, it holds so much meaning. And I like that you address this like notion of your career will come and go, because of course, and by the way, if you don't feel like you have a vocation and you quote, just have a job or a career and you're thinking about being child free, that's also okay.
Fine. Yeah.
Yeah. 100%. Yeah. So this isn't to say like you need to have, you pull things from the ether. Is that
right? Yes.
Am I saying it right? Yeah, I know the words. One of these words I read and I don't say. You don't have to be like Reena in that sense. But I think the idea that like, oh, your job won't keep you warm at night sort of thing. Your job won't be there on your deathbed, or your vocation. Like, what would you say to someone like that who's like, well, Reena, you know, your music is like, it's not going to be there to comfort you in your loneliest days. Someone might say that. What would you say?
So number one, I think it absolutely is. And it has, it's like, it's interesting because last year I wrote a Requiem, and, for those who don't know, Requiem, Mass for the Dead. And so I wrote this Requiem, and I was really deeply contemplating, okay, what does it mean to lose someone? What does it mean to navigate that? And it's like tomorrow I'm going to get on a plane and go to Canada for my aunt's funeral. And there's a part of me that thinks like, wow, I mean, this is such a sad occasion. And I'm also just like, my whole life has been about processing these emotions through music. And so in a way, I feel curious. I feel like I have really stared down into the line of death through my music for a lot of years. And so being able to kind of harness that and be there and be present with all that time has taught me and given me, I think that's really amazing. The other thing I'll note is that one thing that people say about parenthood is like, oh, it doesn't feel like anything else. There's no other feeling that's like parenthood. And that's probably totally true, right? Like I
Yeah.
will not know that feeling. However, there is also, you cannot imagine the feeling of sitting in an audience and having this thing that was in your head suddenly being played by like an orchestra or being sung by a choir. And it's like as if you had a dream and then suddenly people are enacting it so beautifully on stage. I mean, that's a feeling that a lot of people don't know. And let me say, it is
Yeah.
an amazing feeling. So I think there are a lot of feelings that not everyone is going to experience. And it's okay to pick the feeling that you want to experience.
Yeah. Wow, I get goosebumps by that description. And of course, it's like it pales in comparison with what it must actually feel like, but it must be incredible. And of course, these are, the world's top performers in their particular
Yeah.
instruments or voice opera. What I know you don't write
Yeah.
operas, but like these are top performers. So I can
Yeah.
only imagine like how exquisite that must be to see
Yeah.
your work these pieces can take years in some cases,
Yeah.
or is it,
Yeah.
like to see that come to life? What an incredible thing.
Yeah.
And I have to say, I think this line of questioning and discussion probably ties quite well to this idea of legacy, which,
Yes.
legacy, I think we first of all have to ask ourselves, what's our personal relationship with the idea of legacy, i.e., how important is it to have a legacy and what is a legacy? But I know a lot of parents like to think about the idea of leaving something behind in the form of their children, which I've seen some pretty funny jokes and memes, by the way, of like, I don't know, like, what's little Billy Bob going to do for the world? Like, you really think that they're going to be the next Nobel Prize winner? Maybe. Sorry, Billy Bob's like a sort of Southern name. This is probably me poking fun at a few types of parents. But of course, children, can be, for many people, like it feels like an important legacy and a continuation of one's name or one's ideals or values. Do you have a relationship with this idea of legacy? And if so, what is your legacy, or what would you like it to be?
Yeah, it's interesting because I like if you had just asked me and if I hadn't become a composer, I
Mm-hmm.
feel like there was nothing in me personally that really cared about leaving a legacy. To me, it's more about what happens in the moment between you and someone else. How can you because think about what a concert is. Those people who are sitting in the audience and on the stage, you will never have those people together in the same place ever again. And so you have that one chance to connect with them really deeply. And that is what the nature of the job is. So it is
Mm-hmm.
ephemeral, but we all know that there are moments that have influenced us so deeply that it's not like we're experiencing those moments again and again. It's just that
Mm-hmm.
that one moment made such an impact on us. So to
Mm.
me, my actual philosophy and the thing, my value system is to focus on each individual moment and how can I be at the best person I can be in that moment. But then the
Mm-hmm.
thing about composing is it's really only legacy, right? Because when I'm on a stage, when my music is performed on a stage, most of the other people that are performed on that stage are people who have been dead for hundreds of years, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
Beethoven, Bach, those are the other composers who are getting performed alongside my work. And we think about composers as being either like young or dead. I kind of think it's like this really weird thing in our field. And
Yeah.
so as a 41-year-old, I'm still considered young in this field. And so what's interesting though is that your music, because it's written down and it's in the style of classical music where people can perform it without you and have their own
Mm-hmm.
relationship to it,
Mm.
that is already legacy. And so
Mm.
I try to think about the music that I want to leave in the world and not about it being the continuation of me, but that I am this conduit. Right. And especially a conduit between two different cultures of classical music. And I want those people to be able to communicate with one another. And so,
Mm-hmm.
in a way, I feel like maybe I'm just a good matchmaker, or I'm like just that friend who's like, hey, come to this party and meet all these other cool people. That's what I think my
Yeah.
music is. So it's not about doing my will, it's about being good to
Mm.
the other people who are performing that piece. And
Yeah.
so if I can leave that legacy of just giving people the tools to communicate well with one another, that's what I've already done. And I
Yeah.
mean, I will say also that, so I wrote this piece in 2016,
Mm-hmm.
2017 called This Love Between Us. It was this oratorio. So it's a massive piece for choir and orchestra and stuff. And I remember I was sitting on the stage of Avery Fisher Hall, Lincoln Center, New York. That was where the premiere of it was. And I was kind of guiding the Indian musicians who were playing with this orchestra and choir. And I remember just having this feeling of like, if this is the last thing I do in this world, that's fine. Like I have left
Wow.
my mark on this world. And I felt that ever since, that I was like, okay, look, this piece has clearly done something in the world that's beyond me, and everything that I have after that is just gravy. Like I'm so lucky to be alive and to continue to write, but I don't
Yeah.
have any feeling that if I were to die tomorrow, anything there would be any stone left unturned.
Yeah. Okay. You see the watery eyes. People listening to audio only. Reena's really moved me. How beautiful. I mean, how few people can say, you know, hey, if this is the last thing I do, if I die tomorrow, like I'm good. I've done the thing. I've made such a profound impact, even if just in this singular moment. That's an incredible thing. Yeah. Wow. Okay, so I'm curious, would you say, I know some people, when we choose a child-free path, people will say, you know, you can still have relationships with young people, you can have involvement and connection and mentorship. And I just want to say that's not everyone's desire. Some people choose child-free and they're like, yeah, I'm just not like the kid or the young person. That being said, I understand for you, you have had and continue to have sort of a mentorship role in certain young people's lives. And so I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit about that and how that's all sort of evolved and what that has meant to you.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's interesting because, again, to go back to something I said earlier, when I think about what my maternal instinct, for lack of a better word, is, it's not with very, very young kids. I think there are many people who are just much better at that than I am. For me, if I have to pinpoint it, it's probably from the time that kids are in middle school to the time they're like out of college. And that's the time when they're trying to make big decisions about their lives. They're trying to understand who they are. And it's also a time where they need more than just their biological parents to help them find their way in the world. And, you know, we all know there are people who are deeply influential to us at those stages of our lives. And certainly for me, there were those people. And I think one of the things that my parents did that was amazing is, you know, they knew that they were immigrants in this country. They knew that even though, you know, they had master's degrees from other places, they weren't necessarily equipped to help me do what I needed to do in America. And especially because going into music, certainly there's no one in my family who has been a professional musician. And so they kind of really prioritize putting me in front of those mentor figures and getting me to the doorstep of these people who could then take me to the next level. And so I've taken that very seriously, both as a mentee when I was younger, but also now that I'm older, to be a mentor in that way. And so again, like I said, I don't teach at a program, but what I do is I travel the country and, you know, maybe I would say, you know, 8 to 10 times a year, I'm at a university, I'm at a high school, I'm, you know, working with a choir or an orchestra or a group at that place. And I'm actually able to get really deep with them about, you know, first engaging the topic of my music, then just answering their questions. And then what I find is that there are students who just opt in, where there's a couple people who have that moment where they're like, I just need to know this woman. I just need to be in her presence. And I'll let them reach out to me. I'll always say, look, I'm very easy to find, you know, please come find me. And if they've opted in, usually they want that kind of mentorship relationship.
Yeah.
And we just know, okay, the fit is right. I have something that they can offer that I find them really interesting. And so I'd say there's probably right now 20 to 25 people that are just in my orbit in whatever way. And some of them I've known for decades, and some of them I've just met recently. And I just allow them to have the relationship with me that they want to have. And so to me, it's like, it's so incredible because they'll, you know, I'll hear from them regularly, like they'll email me and be like, hey, I just got this really great opportunity. Hey, this thing happened. And I'm so, so, so proud of these students. And I think, you know, I'm also able to help them make really difficult decisions, things that maybe they don't feel comfortable, or in the context of a specific program, they're like, oh, if I talk to this professor, maybe I won't get the opportunity in their class or something like that. I'm able to be an outside voice that can give them, that's really just there for them. And so to me, I feel like that's something that feeds me, and that's all I need. Like there's no part of me that feels like I need more involvement in their life than I have. And I love the fact that it is an opt-in relationship. So,
Yeah. 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 I like that idea. I mean, I guess presumably people who are listening, if they're thinking about parenthood, that's a very opt-in relationship as well. But it's not for the children in the sense that like we can't control who our parents are. And, most of us love or initially loved our parents. And then, of course, difficult relationships can transpire over time. But the idea that like there's a constant opting in, it's not ever obligation or guilt or shoulds or because we're related. It's like, it exists
yeah.
for different reasons.
Well, and I'll also say for many of the students, especially if they're on the younger side, I actually have great relationships with their parents too, because their parents will often know, like, okay, this is as much as we're able to give our kids. Thank you for actually taking the time to give our kids more than that. And they're also, I have, great relationships with both parents and kids. And for most of my life, like now I'm reaching the age where I'm closer to the age of the parents. But for most of my life, I was kind of in between the age of the student and the parent. And that was great because I was young enough that the student felt, oh, I'm only a few steps ahead of them. And I was old enough that the parent felt like I was responsible enough to entrust their kid to me. So that was also a really great role to be in that I think, so many students are, and so many young people are, when they have those people in their lives, it really, really benefits them.
Yeah, definitely.
And again, I'll also say it's not that you can't be a parent and also do this. It's just that for me, that's where I choose to focus 100% of my energy with young people.
Yeah. Good caveat. Thank you. Something I said that we would touch on at the beginning of this conversation, I just want to delve into a little bit, is you are an only child, correct?
Yes.
Is your husband an only child?
No, he's an older brother though.
Okay. Well, he's not here today, so we're not going to talk about him. The reason why though it could be relevant, and I actually am curious, does his brother have kids?
No.
Okay.
So there's no grandchildren. Yeah.
Yeah. And I'm interested, like, first of all, and I didn't ask, but what was, you mentioned, there was this sort of moment of breaking your mom's heart. What was the response from your mom? And I'm not sure if your dad is alive or if you have a relationship with him. I know you've mentioned your mom a few times in the past, but what the response was from your parent or parents, and then what it was like from his family and like how you navigated that. And then the second piece, of course, is, okay, as only children, I've got to assume there may be a feeling of additional pressure. It's something I do hear from a number of listeners and clients of mine if they're only children.
It's interesting because I think my parents feel very differently about my not having children. And I think for my mother, I can understand and I can really hold her grief about that because every other person in her family, she's the youngest of 4 children. And every other person, I think by now, is a great grandparent and has a variety of great grandchildren, and all of that. And so I think she was kind of seeing her life go that way and just kind of assuming that it would. And then because even now, we're fine about it now. And it's not that she's not sad. And it's not that I still don't feel a little, guilt and sadness that I can't give her that thing. But I think she also understands, like, oh, I just really chose this different path that does feel right for me. Maybe like you were saying, your mother was like, oh, you were making these decisions. It does make sense. And so I do feel like she's really been as supportive as she can be, knowing that she's, in her heart, all she would want is for me to have children. My dad is a really different story because I think he and I are much more alike, where initially, like, look, I'm not going to lie. They sat me down and had this huge intervention where they were like, look, here are all the reasons you need to have kids, and really, really tried to pressure me. And there were a couple years in there that
This is the story we need, Reena. Sorry, this is the story we need. Okay. I'm
exactly.
like, great, her mom's supportive. And what else? Okay, so there was an intervention. Sorry to cut you off. Things are getting juicy now.
Yes. Oh, no. There was a serious intervention where, again, it was the pandemic. They invited me over. I hadn't been over to their house in probably a year or something, even though they lived 20 minutes away from me. And they were like, look, these are the 10 points, and they had written out a list of all these reasons why I should have children and how I was going to regret it and blah, blah, blah. And it's interesting because I do have this relationship with my parents where I push back on them when I don't agree with them about things.
Yeah.
And when I was younger, it was harder because obviously you have less behind you, so you don't know if you're right or not. And again, I don't know if I'm right about anything still, but I do know that I have more experience of, again, that lived feeling of when it feels right and when it doesn't. And so it was tense after that because of course, I came home, talked to my husband, and I think my husband was just really mad at my parents for trying to pressure me. And he's always been my biggest advocate in so many ways. And so I think for him, he was like, just really kind of like ready to fight about it. And that was tough, but I think again, it was this slow deflation after that moment where my parents realized, okay, we've held her to the wall and tried absolutely everything we can to get her to have kids. And she's said no. And what else, what other tools do we have? There's nothing that we can do now. And I think it was just a combination of that and me then actually having to defend the fact that I didn't want to have kids that made me a little bit more convicted about it. Because before I was like, I don't know, we'll see. And after that, I was like, oh, I'm actually realizing that I'm having to fight so hard for this because it's something I do feel strongly about in a way that I might not have if my parents hadn't really polarized me in that way. Again, it's possible, and it is possible to kind of come back together after that. And it's as much credit to my parents that they are not still trying to pressure me as it is to me for understanding that I get it. I get why they want grandkids. I get why they think that that's the right path. Because also bear in mind, my parents really, really, really wanted to have me. They had me very late. They wanted more children than me. And I was all that was possible for them. My mom told me later on that she had wanted to have many kids and that it just wasn't, physically possible for them at that time. And so my mom had me when she was 38 years old, and that was it. And so my life was amazing in a lot of ways as an only child because they were putting the love that they wanted to have this big family into this one child. And so I got the benefit of so much of that. But I think they could also realize that just because that's what they wanted, it wasn't necessarily what I wanted. So yeah, I mean, it's still a working relationship. We're still working on it, but I think we're able to talk about it openly. And that's the most important thing. The other thing I was just going to say is that, kind of returning to the thing about my dad, is that for him, I think after this whole intervention thing happened, he then kind of saw himself in me, right? Which is that I think if he had just been in a different situation, if he had been more stable in this country when he was a young person, he might have had a more artistic career. I do think I get a lot of my artistic side from him. And I think he sees what I do as like this dream that is the next level of what he would have wanted to do. So when I'm talking about my work to him, I can see my mom is just like, oh my gosh, it seems like you're so busy. You have so much to do. My dad is like, tell me details. Who did you talk to? Where did you go? What happened? And even when I was at Yale, he was the kind of person who wanted to go to an Ivy League school and wanted to get a higher education there and just couldn't afford it. He came from Pakistan. The fact that he went to a small university in Florida was already major for him. But he used to come visit me and just sit in the library because he just wanted to feel that feeling of like, what would it be like to go to an Ivy League school like that? And so in a way, I feel like the older I get, the more my dad is like, hey, you're actually living the dream that I wanted to live. And I'm so proud of you. And that's amazing. It's really amazing.
Yeah. It sounds like you have a really good, and that's not to say it's not without its challenges, but good relationship with your parents where there's a striving for that sort of like mutual understanding of one another and like a working and commitment. I really thank you for your honesty that like it is a work in progress and there are challenges. And I think a couple of things I take away from this is that you haven't shied away from conflict about this. And I know for a lot of people, it can be really hard to upset someone. It can be really hard to be told you're wrong. It often can make us second guess ourselves and have a lot of doubt. And yet you were willing to like go in the fire and be like, okay, cool. Like these are your 10 points. Here's my 10 counter arguments. This is what I've decided. And it sounds like you both, gained strength and confidence through some of that conflicts that the three of you, I guess, have had. But at the same time, I feel like maybe part of the reason you were also able to have those tough conversations is because you had, you understood and understand the reasons why you've chosen this path. And I think, I know for me, the more convicted and confident that I am in my own decision, the easier it becomes to have conversations with other people. Because if somebody says, well, your life's not going to have meaning, I can say, well, but my life does have meaning, you know? Whereas if I felt like it didn't have meaning, then of course that kind of argument, if you will, would make me second guess myself, right? So I think having thought through and like considering other people's opposition to our choices can help us then become confident in what we've chosen.
Well, and for that matter, I went through a lot of that with music, right? Because my parents were never unsupportive of me being a musician, but there were certainly, you imagine, I come from a diaspora Indian community where I'm the generation where everyone forced their kids to be like doctors and lawyers and engineers, right? Yeah. And then there's this one weirdo who's like a classical composer. What even is that, right? And so having to defend my choices of wanting to be a musician to various people within my community, that kind of gave me that conviction and the ability to think that way. Yeah. And then I will also say, it's absolutely true. There are so many times where people are not ill-intentioned at all. They're just like, well, you know, when are you guys having kids? What's happening? And I don't take offense to those things at all because I just have made my decision and I'm confident. And of course, I completely understand women who are still deciding and that really throws them off and makes them feel terrible. But for me, it's just been this process of like, oh my gosh, it's about them. They're asking because they care and they see that my husband and I are in love and, you know, whatever. So again, it comes from being a musician and being in a situation where you have a piece performed and then people come and talk to you about it. And what they tell you is completely different things about this exact same set of sounds that they've heard. And so you just realize this is not about me. This is really about them having experience. And the more that I can do to not alienate them insofar as like they're not saying things that are like actually mean to me, the more we can then open the door to have a real discussion about these things.
Yeah. Yeah. I like the parallels that you offer with the music world in this decision and your experiences there. And I think for all of us, you know, whether we're on the fence or have made a decision or close to making a decision, like looking at other areas of our lives, you know, whether to go back to the beginning of our conversation, it's a certain feeling we've had or a sense of knowing, whether it's recognizing that we have resilience and tenacity to see our way through difficulties, whether it's other difficult conversations that we've had. Like, I think looking for those kind of parallels, it can both offer us different approaches to this decision. And it also can be sort of evidence that like, we've got this, we can do this, we can find our way through when we start to feel hopeless and like we're never going to reach a decision. So.
Exactly. Yeah.
All right. Before we wrap things up, I just want to hear, like, what are some of the most wonderful things that you love most about your child-free life?
Ooh, I mean, I think just the ability to have very long periods of time where I can go deep and focus on my art. I think that's really the main thing. I also love that, you know, I can travel a lot because a lot of the mentorship work that I do happens all over the US and now even in other countries. And I think what's been amazing, especially when, you know, in the US, we're having all kinds of issues of people just feeling different ways about different things. It's been just a tough time in the US, I think. And what is so helpful is that because I'm always somewhere, I'm always traveling. And a lot of times I'm traveling to places that have very different political views than I do. It's amazing to actually meet people up close and see who they are, because I feel like it gives me the ability to put a face of someone that I love and care and about and respect onto whatever that other argument is. So I think for me, just the ability to actually get to experience so much of the world has been a really wonderful thing about my life.
Yeah. Awesome. Okay. We have our classic rapid fire questions we like to ask at the end of these conversations. So the first two are: finish the sentence. Being child-free is?
Wonderful.
Great answer. Who doesn't want wonderful? Okay. Being child-free is not?
Lonely.
What is one tool or resource that you think would help people with this decision?
I think it was something like what I said about actually find how to trust your intuition about things. Find a time when you can remember in your body how it felt to be really deeply fulfilled with something, and then find a time where it felt like you just made a choice that you weren't fulfilled with, and try to use those as metrics when things come at you. Even on Keltie's podcast, you see all the interviews. Some of them are with people who have children, and some of them are with people who don't have children. Which is the one you try to go to first? What's the one you want to listen to? Just take those things into account as far as your gut feelings.
Yeah, good answer. What is one thing that you want moms to know?
I love your kids. I have so many great mom friends, and it's amazing to watch these children grow up. Like, I just have to say, I have a dear friend who has a 3-year-old who is, she lives in Paris. And so her child, she speaks English, but her child doesn't speak English yet. And just this thought of like, oh my gosh, I'm going to be part of this child learning English. I'm like, wow, how cool is that? Like, I want to be there 100% for this person's life. And the fact that I don't have a child myself actually makes me feel so, so, so deeply invested in the lives of the children of my friends. So yeah, it's certainly not all these weird tropes about people who don't have kids, hate kids. People who don't have kids feel all kinds of ways about kids, but I personally, seeing a really conscientious parent and child it makes me so happy.
Yeah, agree. All right, lastly, if you could give one piece of advice to someone who's currently on the fence about whether or not to have kids, what would that piece of advice be?
Ooh, I would say just trust yourself. Just trust yourself. Because Keltie, you've said this before, is like, there's joy on both sides of this decision. It's not like, oh, there's some abyss where you fall into a pit of nothingness if you choose the wrong thing, and then it's just all rainbows and roses on the other side. That's not the case with any major life decision. So just trust that you know what is right for you, and see if you can follow that gut instinct.
Amazing. All right, Reena, I love this conversation so much. It was
Me too.
As wonderful as I thought it would be, and then some.
Me too.
How can people connect with you, or what do they need to know? What are all the things? We'll include, by the way, as we said, a couple links to Reena's pieces, if I'm allowed to do that in the show notes.
Absolutely.
But where can people find you?
Yeah, I'm on Instagram, just at Reena Esmail. I'm on all the platforms. I have my website, reenaesmail.com. Bear in mind, this is the first interview I have ever done in my life that is not about music. So if you look me up on podcast apps, it's literally all me talking about music. So, Keltie, I just have to say thank you for this, because I'm so used to all the specific talking points around my career. And it's so nice to actually be able to get personal and vulnerable about my life and about something that's really important to me. So thanks for this opportunity.
Yeah, it's been a lot of fun. And sorry if we talk too much about music, It was very top level, I'm sure. The other episodes that you've been on, I'm sure, go a little more granular with the music talk. So, I'm sure we have some classical musicians. Maybe there's a composer amongst us. Who knows? But
I'm sure.
I think anybody with a creative, artistic, and I'm sure everyone listening is going to really enjoy this, but I especially imagine that people who have a really robust creative life will appreciate everything you've shared. So thank you.
Oh, I hope so.
Yeah. Well, thank you again for coming on. Wishing everyone listening a beautiful rest of their day, and we'll be back here soon. Okay, now that we've wrapped up today's conversation, this is the part of the episode where I tell you that you need to subscribe, rate, and review the podcast. And you really need to do that. And I'm going to tell you why. And that is because one of the big ways that people find and discover new podcasts like this one is through reviews. So if you yourself can go say what you loved about this podcast, why people who are on the fence should tune into the Kids Are Child-Free podcast, that's going to help other people who are also wondering, should I have kids or stay child-free, to discover us. Thank you in advance for doing so. I will be featuring some of the reviews in upcoming episodes, so maybe I'll share yours. You never know. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day, and I'll see you back here soon for our next episode.